This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for October 29th, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cuboids?
Christina Roach.
Hey everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hi, Checkers.
We have a great show for you today. Christina is going to investigate whether eagles are racking up roaming charges. And Adam is going to lament about the kids these days.
That's right.
And then I'm going to end with a book review about Practical Ethics by Peter Singer. But first, we've gotten some mail recently, Adam, about a segment you did. Care to tell us more?
Yeah. So last week I did a segment on Hillary Clinton wanting to be an astronaut as a child. I mentioned and repeatedly mentioned that NASA didn't send anyone to space till 1965. We got quite a few pieces of feedback on this, such as the following from Beta. This was the first we got. And here's a bit which highlights a few times I made the mistake. And I quote, Adam said NASA hadn't sent any astronauts into space till 1962. That's wrong. In 1961, NASA sent 2 astronauts into space. Alan Shepard in the Mercury spacecraft named Freedom 7 on May 5th, 1961, and Virgil Gus Grissom in the Mercury spacecraft called Liberty Bell 7 on July 21st, 1961. While both flights were suborbital, i.e. they did not complete at least one orbit of the Earth, being essentially ballistic flights up into space and back down, they did make it into space. 100 kilometers, see Wikipedia entry for Kármán line, since the apogee of both flights were a bit more than 185 kilometers. Perhaps Adam thought of 1962. That's when NASA achieved the first orbital manned spaceflight with John Glenn's Flight of Friendship 7 on February 20th, 1962. In reality, though, he was the 3rd astronaut and 5th human into space. Moving on, Adam said, 1961, there were no astronauts in space because NASA hadn't sent any until 1965. This is wrong and inconsistent with what he said earlier. By the beginning of 1965, NASA had completed the Mercury program, having flown 6 astronauts into space. Adam repeated his 1965 gaffe when he said the important part of this story isn't that NASA didn't have astronauts in space until 1965. Hey, everybody makes mistakes. I still enjoyed this segment. So totally right, of course. I thought maybe it was something about, what counts as going into space, but that wasn't it at all. I tried to remember or track down why I had this number 1965 in my mind, and I can't figure it out. At best as I can reason, I misread something in the days leading up to my segment, perhaps confusing someone saying that Hillary Clinton was 15, maybe remembering that 5, and then it getting transposed on my mind. I don't really know. It was a mistake that I can't even track down to a specific source. Now, I really should have clued in to this not making much sense. As I mentioned that the first woman in space was in 1963. So it seemed unlikely NASA hadn't sent any person in space until 2 years after that. So that's a big mistake on my part, and my apologies for that one. And thanks to everyone for trying to keep us honest and writing in. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks for everyone who writes in. Now to Christina. Are eagles racking up roaming charges?
Well, in a headline worthy of a game of Spot the Fake, here's one from BBC News a couple of days ago. Migrating Russian eagles run up huge data roaming charges. Pat pointed out the curious headline to me, and a quick Goog and several news stories came up right away. The Verge, CTV News, Slashdot, Newsweek, Forbes, New York Times. This begs the question, what is a Russian eagle doing with a cell phone, and who are they calling? Okay, obviously an eagle isn't using a cell phone. So what's going on here? A headline in Forbes might be a little more on point. Migrating eagles racked up a huge roaming SMS bill for researchers. So there's this team of Russian scientists, more specifically ornithologists, who are tracking endangered migrating birds, specifically steppe eagles, by equipping them with SMS transmitters. These tracking devices send text messages with their coordinates 4 times a day, and then the researchers use satellite photos to make sure the birds have migrated safely. Now, the BBC article mentioned that power lines are an especially worrisome threat to the steppe eagle. Now, by the way, this eagle's wingspan is serious. 1.65 to 2.15 meters, or 5.4 feet to 7.1 feet. That's the wingspan. Pat, you had a heart-stopping encounter with an eagle during your band days?
Yeah, it sounds... I think it was even bigger than that. We were driving through, I want to say, North Dakota or Montana, and we pulled over to the side of the road, and out of the ditch came a bald eagle, and it came directly at me, and I swear its wingspan was more than 8 feet.
Yeah.
They're huge.
And did it just fly over your head?
I jumped into the van. I have no idea where I went.
The team from the Russian Raptors Research and Conservation Network also volunteer at a wild animal rehabilitation center in Novosibirsk. And if we have any Russian listeners, I hope they're impressed because I did look up that pronunciation. They currently track 13 eagles which breed in Siberia and Kazakhstan, but fly to South Asia for the winter. I've linked a graphic for you guys in the bottom of tonight's show notes, and it maps the eagles' winter migration routes, and it's wild. Just take a peek. These birds venture from southern Russia and Kazakhstan into Iran and Pakistan. I did a quick search of the distance between southern Russia and Iran, and that's around 2,400 kilometers.
Wow.
I read that the steppe eagle can migrate as far as India and Africa. The one steppe eagle named Min, not sure how to pronounce that, flew from Kazakhstan to Iran, racking up some hefty roaming charges. So hefty, in fact, that they literally broke the budget and the scientists ran out of money to finish their research project. An SMS message in Kazakhstan was 15 rubles or 30 US cents, but in Iran it was 49 rubles, which is also 25 times more than in Russia. So Min had a backlog of messages because he was out of Kazakhstan's mobile range, and the researchers certainly did not expect him to fly to Iran, but when he did, the transmitter connected with that mobile network and sent hundreds of messages through. So yeah, this eagle was costing them around $110 per day, but it was, there was a few $1,000s, the total. With no funds left, the inflammable scientists took out a loan and started a crowdfunding campaign, which raised over 300,000 rubles, over $4,700 US. And the mobile company Megaphone stepped in and they wiped out their debt and put them on a more affordable SMS plan. That, coupled with the funds from crowdfunding, they can keep their research running and collect vital data until the end of this year. Elena Schneider, a Siberian-based scientist who is one of the researchers, said that other phone companies reached out offering free SIM cards to their new eagles, ending with, quote, "It's quite an irony because when we started the project and asked for discounts, many of them turned us down." So I assume Megaphone sees a cool social media op here, maybe?
For sure.
A little background on the steppe eagle. The International Union for Conservation of Nature listed it as endangered in 2015, spurring more efforts like this research project. It was really interesting to dig into the eagle's entry on that site. The detailed research they have available to substantiate why the eagle is on the red list is fascinating. I'd never gone to a site that you could look up a species and whether they were endangered or extinct and what that meant and all of the data behind that.
Now, Christina, I heard that their numbers are getting back up, but it's actually unfortunate because they're all using Tinder and they're getting a lot of data charges sent back to those researchers.
Yeah.
This is no problem.
So the assessment scale on this site starts at the first two categories: not evaluated, data deficient, then least concern, near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, extinct in the wild, and finally extinct. So the steppe eagle is in the endangered category. So it's a really cool site if you're interested in what criteria is used to assess whether a species is endangered, etc. Oh, and if you guys are wondering where our friend Min is, as of Saturday afternoon, he was in Yemen.
Thanks, Christina. I think I saw that headline, but I didn't really follow it through, and it's interesting to see this other aspect of the world that's beauty of exploration of science and birds. Adam, I was young once. What was wrong with me?
It's a great question, Darren. Now, I'm what is considered by some to be an old person. Not old enough to know when the first man went to space, but old enough to turn my nose at flossing, dabbing, whatever the kids these days think is cool. As a person of this older generation, it is clear to me, of course, that the kids these days just aren't like they used to be. I'm not the first to feel this way, of course, so what's the deal? Has generation after generation just been the new worst over the past few? So how long ago would you guys say the older generation has been complaining about the younger generation? Darren?
Like, you mean like recorded history, or since humans had language? I'm not sure what your... I don't like. Do chimpanzees currently complain, or our last common ancestor?
Okay, those are very good guesses. Pat and Christina, thoughts?
I agree with Darren 100%, yes.
Okay, so after what I've read, I would have guessed it's been going on roughly since the Neolithic period, when humans started farming, which ended hunter-gatherers' lives, though it's quite possible the hunter-gatherers felt the same way. It's hard to tell. Basically, we have evidence of the older generation complaining about the younger one for over 2,000 years, since at least 624 BCE. And we also have a good idea of why they feel that way, thanks to some research. Since this has been going on this long, it seems unlikely that it's actually been true for this long. Imagine if each successive generation was actually less respectful, less intelligent, and less well-read than the previous one for over 2,000 years. So this would mean that the modern human would be significantly less intelligent, more disrespectful, and more illiterate than our ancestors from 624 BCE. We know, of course, that the opposite is actually true. There has been a gradual increase in intelligence as long as it's been measured, and this is referred to as the Flynn effect, though there may be some evidence that this has started to drop only recently. Literacy is far better now than it was millennia ago, especially in developing countries, and this is universally true.
Just quickly, you said a gradual increase in intelligence. I think that's true over the past several hundred years.
Yeah.
But I'm not quite sure it's true from, like,
1
AD to 800 AD.
Sure, I'm saying as long as intelligence has been measured, as long as IQ has been measured.
Yep,
so
sure.
Yes, that does not go back to 624 BC. You're right there. Respect is perhaps a bit harder to measure, but since we aren't openly hostile to each other, it seems a steady one-way decrease in respect is not something which has actually been happening since thousands of years. Now, before I get to the research, let's look at some examples of ancient people complaining about kids these days. Now, these are from a BBC article by Amanda Ruggerl, who compared some of the modern complaints about millennials to things which have been said before a long time ago. In the kids are lazy department, and I quote, "Many young people were so pampered nowadays that they had forgotten that there was such a thing as walking, as they made automatically for the buses. Unless they did something, the future for walking was very poor indeed." This is from Scottish Rights of Way. More young people should use them. Falkirk Herald, 1951.
Wow, remember when walking was a thing, guys?
To be fair, with Uber,
He's probably right that people walk less, but it's just funny for that to be said. Mm-hmm. Here's one on vanity. "Whither are the manly vigor and athletic appearance of our forefathers flown? Can these be their legitimate heirs? Surely no. A race of effeminate, self-admiring, emaciated fribbles can never have descended in a direct line from the heroes of Poitiers and Agincourt." This is a letter in Town and Country magazine, republished in Paris Fashion, A Cultural History, 1771.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, so
comment on someone's Instagram post, "You emaciated fribble."
Talking about rude, "We defy anyone who goes about with his eyes open to deny that there is, as never before, an attitude on the part of the young folk which is best described as grossly thoughtless, rude, and utterly selfish, from the conduct of young people," from the Hull Daily Mail, 1925. Couple more here about how today's generation can't buy a home. So this is one you kind of hear a lot these days. "Thousands of young fellows have come home from the war intent on setting up a home with the girl of their heart, only to find that there are no homes to be had. Many men, of course, have not waited for houses, but have got married and gone into rooms or to live with relatives, but neither course can be considered very satisfactory. From Nowhere to Set Up House," from the Dundee Courier, 1920. And finally, here's one on blaming parents for the problems of the children. "Parents themselves were often the cause of many difficulties. They frequently failed in their obvious duty to teach self-control and discipline to their own children," from Problems of Young People in Leeds Mercury from 1938. So the article has a bunch more examples like this. You can find that in the show notes, trcpodcast.com. It's worth checking out. I find them all very funny. So the question becomes, if it isn't a matter of the kids of the younger generation being somehow terrible, what's going on? A study by John Protzko and Jonathan Schooler looked to answer this question. They looked at adults aged 33 to 51 and measured 3 traits: youth, disrespecting elders, intelligence, and reading. Now, one factor to consider is that people have been shown to view themselves as being superior to others in many ways. So if you ask someone where they rank on whatever trait, and a majority will consider themselves to be above average, something doesn't add up. And this is generally true. This could partly account for people simply seeing aspects of themselves as being superior to others, in this case, the youth, across many domains, regardless of their own actual abilities. Another factor could simply be that those who do the most disparaging are themselves experts in that particular domain. So, respectful people noticing disrespect, intelligent people noticing a lack of intelligence, and well-read people noticing less inclination to reading. Now, these people would themselves be more likely to surround themselves with similar people in their youth and be shocked by the state of the new generation. The disparity between generations would be an illusion, as they are themselves outliers and not representative of their own generation, but these voices become heard or written down for future BBC articles or whatever for people to see. Now, it turns out that this effect isn't necessary to explain all of the factors, but the research does support it in some way. The view that kids these days have no respect for their elders is held by most people, not just those with a particular respect for elders or authority. That said, those who are more authoritarian did have a stronger belief that the youth of today were less respectful. Similarly, with reading, it was pretty across the board that people of an older generation believed that children don't like to read. But those who read more had a stronger view that children didn't like to read. Alternatively, when dealing with intelligence, there was not a general view amongst most people of all intelligences that the youth were not smart. This was instead a view held only by the more intelligent, which makes this idea that the outliers are making the judgments more plausible just for this metric, for the metric of intelligence, and possibly for others that weren't measured in this research. Still, with these outliers in all cases, there was a stronger view of these differences, and this would account for vocal instances of people making a big deal about it. Now, one aspect of these outliers is that they also disparage others of their same age. So someone who is well-read is more likely to believe that adults these days don't read much. But when talking about the younger generation, this belief is even stronger, thinking that the youth read even less. So the kids these days phenomenon still exists amongst experts who think of themselves as being better than everyone, even their own age.
I think that's an excellent point. So someone has just a general belief that everyone in general is not as good as they are or they used to be, and kids just happen to be a subset of that group.
Yes.
And to your point, yes, a lot of people rank themselves above average, at least in, we'll say, North American psychology studies. And I also wondered, when you were quoting all those things, to what extent is that cherry picking? Not that they didn't exist, but it's hard to know how representative it is of those people in that time. Like, did everyone agree with that particular article's written, right?
Oh,
so
absolutely.
Looking back in history, something appears in, I don't know, New York Times or Fox News or The Atlantic. Does that represent all of my views? A tweet that was very popular? Like, well, maybe some of it, maybe not.
Every time I see a hit piece talking smack about millennials, the way I hear about it is people saying like, oh, here's more boomers complaining about millennials and they don't know what they're talking about. So obviously this is not representative of how everyone feels, but that's a different thing. That's younger people talking about older people, and there's other factors in there.
It's actually a boomer hit piece disguised as a millennial hit piece.
Yes. That's the backwards side that I would also like to see research on, but that's not really what my segment's about. Now, finally, another factor is simply that people have poor memories or misremember what they were like earlier in life. So a person changes drastically through life, including in those ways generations see themselves superior to previous ones. If a person has improved in one such capacity, and then they see that the youth of the younger generation have a lesser capacity, roughly equivalent to what they had in the past, this can be assumed to be a problem with the generation rather than younger people simply being young, as young people have always been. All right. The research backed this up as well. A person who read a lot, for example, would incorrectly recall that their peers used to read a lot when they were younger, but more correctly believe that their peers don't read as much now. So even though they think the kids don't read and my peers don't read, they think the kids back in the day actually read a lot, like I do. So this seems to be a result of people having recent memories of their peers, but filling in the blanks on their peers in the past with their own experience because they don't have as fresh memories of what their peers were doing back when they were younger. So nice research that not only tells us the effect is illusory, but also gives us an idea to why it's illusory. All this said, I think it's worth saying that not all generational differences can be necessarily caused by this effect. But since we know that this effect exists, one should have some skepticism whenever they do suppose that there is some generational difference. So consider this first before you draw the conclusion. Try to look at some data, if you can, to see if it's true. Now, one aspect which can cause great generational change is technology. For most of human history, a person lived in a similar world to that of their parents or even grandparents, living and dying in a nearly identical world. Such people didn't speculate about how the future might differ in technology because they had no reason to think that things would ever change, because their world didn't. Now, this is one reason for which science fiction and time travel fiction is a relatively recent occurrence. Now, more recently, in the past few hundred years, there have been increasing rates of technological change, which seem to be getting faster and faster. The world I live in is almost unrecognizable to what it was like in 1978 when I was born. As such, I was exposed to drastically different technology than my parents' generation was. My father, as an adult, programmed with punch cards, and I learned to code when I was 13 on an affordable home computer. My generation has a relationship with video games that goes back to childhood, which couldn't have been possible for anyone much older than me. They just didn't have video games when they were children. I spent my adolescence without internet access and didn't get a cell phone till I was 35, while my children never knew a world without YouTube or without social media. Now, this doesn't seem to be causing disrespect for elders, less intelligence, or less reading, but some generational differences in interactions with technology are surely likely to occur.
I think that's an excellent series of points and something I was going to bring up, so I'm happy you did.
Yeah.
That, yes, for most of human history, the next 20 years was similar to the previous 20 years. You lived in a world where it was very likely that your elder knew more about that world than you did.
Yeah.
Their skills and experience were applicable and were superior to yours. And that was true probably for most of your life, as long as you lived a certain amount of time. And then now, yes, adults know more than children in many ways of navigating basic aspects of life. But when it comes to technology, which is becoming ever increasingly dominant, children know more than adults.
Yeah.
A lot more.
Yeah.
And so now what you could imagine is, well, why would you defer to someone who knows less than you do? It just doesn't make sense. So I could see the kids would be not so much disrespectful, but appropriately respectful to someone's ability to give them useful information, which is zero.
Yeah.
And that, when you're young, you may care less about history and other things, and things don't make sense and it's too slow because your attention span is shot. But yeah, I think it's a very interesting thing where adults used to know more than children, and now in many ways they do not.
Yeah, so obviously there's going to be an assumed knowledge that comes with that, and that will probably translate to respect, even though respect can also be sort of a semi-independent notion. But yes, that is one metric that can be changed by technology, absolutely. So if you really want to know if there's a difference, you can use data to see differences and whether they're becoming more prevalent over time. And I think some people have done that. And I think a lot of these think pieces about millennials don't. Some of them maybe do. And some of them that do maybe have a point. Not that, it's right or whatever, but there may be some data there. I recently started reading The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. It's an interesting book. I'm not too far into it, but it suggests some terrible ideas are setting up a generation for failure, which seems to be contributing to issues like anxiety amongst the younger generation. It's not about millennials. It's about a younger generation than that. The issues discussed do not seem to be your standard kids these days rantings, though some may view it as that. So it's just an example of where you can have some issues here that aren't really covered by this problem. So kids these days, they're actually quite a bit like kids back in the day. And in most respects, adults have looked down on them since literally thousands of years. There are many reasons for which people think kids are somehow terrible, but this seems to mostly relate to experts having a particularly poor view of the youth in the domain that they excel at, as well as people improving over life and being quite poor at remembering how they actually used to be much worse at things that they're actually very good at now. So how about you try giving today's youth the same respect that you would have liked to have gotten when you were young? We all change drastically through our lives, much more than most of us remember.
Well said.
Adam, you talked about the internet and it coming in video games, but I think about my father, radio and television.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So Technology is definitely a factor, but I don't know that it's just the generation of your kids or our generation.
No, it's from me to my parents, and even from my parents to their parents, right? You go from there not being movies to there being radio, to there being movies, to there being VCRs, to there being Netflix, 2 channels to 100 channels. It's very hard to compare these things.
This one's a talkie.
Yeah. And the way we consume media, and a lot of people my age, are sort of still obsessed with the shows and media that they consumed as children, which seems to be a somewhat new phenomenon as well. So there's a lot of things going on. And you need to see more data than just sort of, here's a feeling I have about the world. But there's reasons for big differences that technology and a lot of other things about our society can entail. But those are more specific than kids these days are dumb, they don't read, and they don't have any respect. Just these general things like that. Even though some of those, as Darren kind of mentioned, may be influenced by that. I think kids probably read less books today, but probably read more because they read on social media and they read their text messages and they read articles and things like that. So there's aspects to these issues, right?
And finally, we turn to Darren for a book review of Practical Ethics by Peter Singer. I recently finished rereading Practical Ethics by Peter Singer. It's an excellent introduction to diverse ethical issues, as Singer's writing is accessible, generally thorough, and quite logical. As it says on the inside, the focus of the book is the application of ethics to difficult and controversial social questions, such as equality and discrimination by race, sex, ability, or species, abortion, euthanasia, and embryo experimentation, the moral status of animals, political violence and civil disobedience, overseas aid and the obligation to assist others, responsibility for the environment, the treatment of refugees. There's even an appendix of him getting what we would now call deplatformed in Germany. Yep. In other words, it's how to have an interesting dinner party where everyone ends up hating each other. It's a great book, and I recommend it. It's nice if you order it. You could use your library, but there's also a free PDF online if you know how to use Google at all. Singer's reasoning is so sound and deployed in such diverse domains, I can't do all the arguments justice, so I'll just speak to a few of them. One of them is that Singer is very persuasive when arguing why we think something is or is not okay. So, experimenting on animals is less popular now, but it's still done. Why is this acceptable? As a little caveat, this book came out in the late 70s, early 80s, and then there was another edition in the 90s. So, things have shifted a bit, but a lot of the arguments are still very applicable.
Sure.
Why is this acceptable? Many people say because animals are not like people. Sure, that is a belief, and a bit of an odd one as people are animals. But as Singer presses us to ask, okay, you may believe that, but how exactly are they different? What is different? And is it a meaningful difference? So then people say, well, they come with sort of different ideas, and most people will know that if they say the amount of fur or walking on 4 legs isn't really going to fly as a good argument, it's not that morally relevant. So they might end up, if they're reasonable, saying something like the capacity to suffer. Like, okay, well, that's your metric. That's the one you chose. So then it would be okay to experiment on severely intellectually disabled babies who have less capacity to suffer than a chimpanzee, and people recoil. And so he's trying to draw on a comparison here, not to start experimenting on babies. That's not the goal. But just to make you think, well, wait a minute. If I'm not okay in one domain, why is it okay in another domain? Again, this moral intellectual consistency. Long ago on the podcast, I covered the bad arguments meat eaters make to justify their actions. By the way, I still eat meat and I'm morally inconsistent. Under the animals eat each other, so why shouldn't we, subsection, he quotes Benjamin Franklin, who's saying like, well, I saw some fish. When I opened up the fish, there were baby fish inside. And so if animals eat each other, well, why can't we? It's like, oh, Benjamin Franklin, you were brilliant about a lot, but that's dumb. Now, then again, it was also a long time ago. So on pages 70-71 in my book, this is a quote. For a start, most animals who kill for food would not be able to survive if they did not, whereas we have no need to eat animal flesh. Next, it is odd that humans, who normally think of the behavior of animals as beastly, should, when it suits them, use an argument that applies that we ought to look to animals for moral guidance. The most decisive point, however, is that non-human animals are not capable of considering the alternatives open to them or reflecting on the ethics of their diet. Hence, it is impossible to hold the animals responsible for what they do, or to judge that because of their killing they deserve to be treated in a similar way. Those who read these lines, on the other hand, must consider the justifiability of their dietary habits. You cannot evade responsibility by imitating beings who are incapable of making this choice. It's so concise, it's so well said, it's so well reasoned, it's just great.
Yeah.
There are so many more interesting arguments, perhaps I'll do segments in the future. To his credit, Singer does acknowledge that he is uncertain about his own views on occasion, and it's even hard to come up with some arguments about why people should act morally if you don't accept the premises. But no book is perfect, even great ones like Practical Ethics. For example, Singer uses or defines the terms conscious, sentient being, human being. He does kind of define them, but I kind of feel is a bit fast and loose, or maybe it doesn't jive with my current understanding of how we might use the word conscious versus something else. As well, some phrases can be misleading or seem misleading. He might say something like, well, the pain experienced by one sentient being is the same as that to another sentient being, meaning a non-human animal compared to a human animal. Mm-hmm. But then he would explicitly talk about the capacities of, say, a human and a pig to suffer are different in a certain way. So you're like, well, wait, can I square this circle for me? So which one matters more? It's just not that often easy to do the utilitarian calculus. Yeah. That said, it's not easy to do any moral calculus once you start thinking about it. It's hard to pit virtues against each other, and if you have moral rules, which one do you violate compared to something else? Yeah. He does talk a little bit about classic versus preference views of utilitarianism, and this largely transfers to things we now call total and average views. I'll maybe explain that in a future show. Although say that stuff is hard to keep track of, and it would have been useful to have a chart in the book that really lays things out. To his credit, it is work by a philosopher. He's like, well, if you accept this view, then this would logically follow from it. But if you more accept this view, then this would logically follow from it. Mm-hmm. And the fact that he has changed his mind over the years is good, but it can make explanations more difficult. In conclusion, it's a good book. Go read it. Thanks for joining us once again, listeners. Christina told us that eagles are, in fact, racking up roaming charges. Cursed those Russian scientists. Adam talked about the kids these days and how they don't listen to our podcast enough. And I gave you a book review of Peter Singer's Practical Ethics, which is great. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, Cuboids.
Stay classy, not smart-assy, no vozabrsk.
We'll talk to you next week, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes.
Sorry, wait 1 second. We have a siren.
Okay.
I can't tell if it's coming toward us or not. Yeah, the Doppler shift isn't detectable at this level.
But they're all Wii U's and there's no ping pong, so I don't know if there's really a big difference there. But
ping pong.
That's how you say. That's how you say the sound of a fire truck in French.
We use in ping-pong.
Oh, I see. Is there a ping pong? What's going on?
But if you listen, the sound of sirens are very different. The police, an ambulance, and a fire siren are very different.
In Quebec or France?
In the world. Well, I don't know. In North America, in Canada.
Well,
like a fire truck goes. No,
yeah,
and a police truck goes.
Yeah, I've seen the Bourne movies.
Okay.
Thanks, Adam.